Caleb Mason didn't flinch when the bank's notice hit his palm. He just fed it to the stove, jaw tight, knuckles white. 3 weeks. That's all the mountain gave him before strangers owned his father's land. So he did what he swore he'd never do. He wired for a wife. Not for love. Just hands to tend the chickens while he fought to save the rest. He never expected the woman who stepped off that stagecoach to burn down his pride instead. Before we begin, hit subscribe, follow this story to the end, and drop the city you're watching from below. The letter came on a Tuesday, and Caleb Mason read it 3 times before he let himself believe it. Notice of foreclosure. 21 days. Failure to remit will result in immediate seizure of the property known as Mason Ridge. He didn't curse. He didn't throw anything. He folded the paper along its crease, walked to the stove, and fed it to the fire like it was nothing more than kindling. He watched the corners blacken and curl, watched Elias Grover's signature disappear into ash, and told himself that a man who still had 2 working hands and a mountain full of timber wasn't beaten yet. But his hands were shaking when he set the poker down. He'd buried his father on this land. He'd buried his brother on this land. He was not about to hand it over to a banker in a clean collar who'd never once climbed higher than the courthouse steps. 21 days, he said out loud to no one, because there was no one left to say it to. He rode into town that afternoon with his hat pulled low and his temper pulled tighter. Cutter's Notch wasn't a big town, 1 street, 1 bank, 1 church, and enough gossiping women in the mercantile to make a man feel like livestock at auction every time he walked past the window. He felt their eyes on him before he even hitched his horse. "There goes the Mason boy," said Mrs. Petayero, loud enough to carry, not quiet enough to pretend she meant it privately. "Land's dying same as his daddy did. Pride's the only thing keeping that place standing." Caleb didn't turn around. He'd learned a long time ago that turning around only fed them. Inside the bank, Elias Grover sat behind his desk, like a man who'd never once missed a meal in his life. Hands folded, smile, thin as a knife's edge. "Mr. Mason," Grover said, "I trust you received the notice." "I received it. And I'm not selling." Grover's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes did. "Nobody said anything about selling, Mr. Mason. The bank simply requires the debt be settled. $320 in full within 21 days. If it isn't, I know what happens if it isn't." "Then you understand my position." "I understand your position just fine," Caleb said, standing. "I don't understand how a man sleeps at night taking land off a family that buried 2 men in the ground to keep it." Grover didn't answer that. He didn't need to. Men like Grover never lost sleep over anything that didn't cost them money. Caleb walked out of that bank with his boots hitting the boardwalk harder than they needed to, jaw so tight it ached, and he didn't stop walking until he'd put half a mile of road between himself and every pitying, mocking face in Cutter's Notch. 21 days. He had chickens dying of some blight he couldn't name. He had a barn with a roof that leaked worse every rain. He had 200 acres of good bottomland going to seed, because one man couldn't work. It cook for himself, keep the house standing, and fight off a bank all at the same time. He needed hands. He needed help. And there wasn't a woman in Cutter's Notch who'd have him not with the land the way it was, not with his name the way it was. So he did the only thing he had left to do. He walked into the telegraph office, and with his hand only shaking a little, he wrote out an advertisement for a wife. Rancher, Sound Health seeks capable woman for marriage and homestead work. No romance expected. Room board and honest partnership offered. Reply. Cutter's Notch, care of C. Mason. He read it twice before he handed it over. "You sure about this, Caleb?" asked the clerk, a boy young enough to still think love was a thing that happened to people like in the dime novels. "No," Caleb said, "but I'm sure about the alternative." The reply came back faster than he expected. 11 days later, a woman by the name of Evelyn Carter, presently of Boston, willing to travel west for marriage and employment. No further explanation given. No mention of romance, no mention of hope. Nothing but a name, an age 27, and a single line that struck him as strange even then. "I am not afraid of hard work or hard truths. I expect the same from you." He hadn't thought much of it at the time. He'd been too busy counting days, too busy patching fences and trying to save what was left of a flock of chickens that seemed determined to die out of spite. But standing at the stagecoach stop 2 weeks later, that line came back to him, and for the first time, something in his gut told him this woman wasn't going to be what he expected. He was right. The stagecoach rolled in dust and noise, and half of Cutter's Notch had turned out to watch, not because they cared about Caleb Mason, but because nothing entertained a small town faster than a mail-order bride arriving to marry a man everyone already assumed was ruined. "Poor thing don't even know what she's walking into," Pedayero murmured to her sister just loud enough. Caleb heard it. He always heard it. He kept his eyes on the stagecoach door and his hat gripped tight in both hands, because it seemed like the kind of moment that called for taking his hat off, even if he wasn't sure why. The door opened. A boot came down. First, sensible dark leather, nothing fancy. Then a woman stepped down into the dust of Cutter's Notch, and Caleb felt every plan he'd made about how this conversation would go evaporate on the spot. She wasn't soft. That was the first thing he noticed. Not soft in the face, not soft in the way she held herself. She had sharp eyes the color of good coffee, and they moved across the town, the mercantile, the bank, the church, the dying tree in the square, like she was already taking inventory of everything wrong with the place. She didn't look at him first. She looked at the town. Then she looked at him, and something in her gaze made him feel like a column of figures that didn't add up. "Mr. Mason," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Evelyn Carter." She didn't offer her hand for kissing or courting. She offered it for shaking firm, like she was closing a business deal. "I assume you're the one who sent the wire." "I am." She held his eyes a beat longer than was comfortable. "You look like a man who hasn't slept in a week." "I look like a man who's got a lot riding on the next 21 days, ma'am." 19, she corrected. The stagecoach was delayed 2 days. If your notice said 21 from the date it was posted, you've got 19 left. Caleb blinked. Nobody had corrected his math in front of half the town before. Somewhere behind him, he heard Pedayero's sharp intake of breath, like she'd just witnessed a duel. "You always start conversations doing arithmetic, ma'am." "I start conversations with facts, Mr. Mason. I find they save time." That should have been the moment he laughed it off. Made some joke soften the exchange, the way men were supposed to, with new brides fresh off the stage. Instead, he found himself just standing there, hat still in his hands, staring at a woman who'd been in Cutter's Notch for less than 2 minutes, and had already corrected him, assessed the town, and made it clear she hadn't come here for romance any more than he had. "Well," he said finally, "wagons this way." She didn't take his offered arm. She picked up her own trunk before he could reach for it, hefting it with more strength than her frame suggested she had, and walked toward the wagon like she already knew where it would be. "Ma'am, I can carry that. I've carried it this far." "It ain't about whether you can, ma'am. It's about whether you should have to." She stopped, turned and looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite name. Not quite surprise, not quite suspicion. Something more careful than either. "Nobody's asked me that in a long time," she said. It wasn't warmth in her voice, but it wasn't ice either. It was something in between. Something that told Caleb this woman had come from somewhere that hadn't been kind to her, even if she hadn't said so outright. He took the trunk anyway. She let him. Though her jaw stayed tight the whole time, like she was cataloging the moment for later, deciding what it meant that he'd insisted. The ride out to Mason Ridge was quiet at first, the kind of quiet that sat heavy between two people who both had things they weren't saying. Caleb broke it first. "I ought to tell you plain, ma'am, before we go any further. This ain't a rich man's spread you're marrying into." "I didn't come west looking for a rich man, Mr. Mason. No, I don't reckon you did, given you're marrying a stranger sight unseen. But I want you to know what you're walking into. Bank's after the land. Chickens are dying of something I can't name. Barn roof's got more holes than shingle. I need a wife who can tend the flock, keep house, and maybe if there's time left in the day, help me figure out how in the hell I'm supposed to find $320 in 19 days. Evelyn was quiet for a moment, watching the land roll by dry grass, cracked fence posts, a scattering of cattle too thin for summer. "Tend the flock," she repeated. "Yes, ma'am." "Keep house." "Yes, ma'am." "And you expect me to do this how exactly? With what supplies? What system have you kept records of the flock's mortality rate? Or are you simply watching them die and hoping the pattern reverses itself?" Caleb's hands tightened on the reins. "Ma'am, I don't rightly know what a mortality rate is. It's the number of birds you've lost, divided by the number you started with, expressed as a percentage over time. It tells you whether you're dealing with disease, poor feed predation, or simple neglect. Without it, you're guessing. And guessing, Mr. Mason, is how men lose land." He looked over at her, and for the first time, something in his chest shifted. Not attraction, not yet, but something sharper. Something like being seen clean through. "You talk like a banker," he said. "I worked for one. 8 years in Boston. Bookkeeping, accounts, ledgers. I understand numbers the way you understand land." "Then why in God's name did you answer a wire looking for a wife to tend chickens?" Her jaw tightened just slightly, and for the first time Caleb saw a crack in that composed, sharp exterior. Something underneath that she didn't want him to see. "Because Boston had nothing left for me," she said, and her voice was flat, controlled, the voice of a woman who'd rehearsed saying this exact sentence without letting it break. "And because I'd rather build something from nothing than keep watching men take credit for work I did." Caleb didn't push. He'd learned enough about grief and shame in his own life to know when a door had been opened only a crack, and when pushing it further would slam it shut for good. "Well," he said instead, "I reckon we're both starting from nothing then." "I don't start from nothing, Mr. Mason." She turned to look at him, and there was steel in her eyes now, steel that hadn't been there a moment before. "I start from what's in front of me, and I make it work." They crested the last hill before Mason Ridge came into view, and Caleb felt the familiar tightness in his chest that he felt every time he looked at what was left of his father's land. The sagging barn, the fence line broken in 3 places, the coop where too many of his birds lay dead in the dust that morning before he'd even left for town. He watched Evelyn's face as she took it in. He braced for pity. He braced for the kind of look Petayero gave him in town. The look that said, "Poor proud fool, throwing good effort after a lost cause." He didn't get either. She got down from the wagon before he could help her, walked straight to the coop, crouched down and picked up one of the dead birds without flinching, turning it over in her hands like she was reading something written on its feathers. "How long has this been happening?" she asked. 3 weeks, maybe 4? All at once or gradually? Started slow, getting worse. "What are you feeding them?" "Corn mostly, whatever scraps we got." "Show me the feed." He led her to the small shed where he kept the grain, and she opened the sack, ran her fingers through it, brought a handful up close to her face, and smelled it before he could even ask what she was doing. "This is damp," she said, "and it smells of mold. You've been feeding your flock spoiled grain for weeks, Mr. Mason. That's not a mystery illness. That's poison, slow and steady." Caleb felt something cold settle in his stomach. "I didn't know." "No," she said, not unkindly, but not gently either. "You didn't check. There's a difference. I've had a bank breathing down my neck and a farm falling apart around my ears, ma'am. I ain't had time to smell every sack of feed I bought." "Then you need someone who does have that time," she said, standing, dusting off her hands. "Which I believe is precisely why you sent for a wife." He didn't have an answer for that. She was right, and being right seemed to be something she did often with a precision that left no room for a man's pride to hide. "I'll want to see your ledgers," she said, already walking toward the house. "My what?" "Your accounts, your debts, every dollar you owe, every dollar you're owed, every transaction you've made in the last year. If I'm going to help you save this land in 19 days, I need to understand exactly how bad the damage is." "Ma'am, I don't rightly keep books like that." She stopped walking and turned to look at him with an expression somewhere between disbelief and despair. "You're 19 days from losing your family's land," she said slowly, And you don't keep books. I know the land. I know the work. Numbers ain't never been my strength. Well, Mr. Mason. She turned back toward the house, shoulders squared like a woman preparing for battle. They're about to become mine. That evening, after Caleb had shown her the small bedroom that would be hers, separate from his, a fact she noted with a small approving nod that told him she'd been braced for something else entirely. She sat at his kitchen table with every scrap of paper he owned spread out in front of her. Receipts, bank notices, a half-torn ledger he'd started keeping years ago and abandoned within a month. Bills of sale for cattle he could no longer remember selling. She organized them into piles with the quiet, ruthless efficiency of a surgeon, and Caleb found himself standing in the doorway, watching her work, feeling something he hadn't expected to feel, not attraction exactly, though there was something in the way she moved that caught his eye and held it. Mostly, it was something closer to shame. "You've been paying interest on top of interest for the last 6 months," she said without looking up. "Did you know that?" "I knew the payments kept climbing." "They've climbed because Grover restructured your loan without properly explaining the new terms to you. This clause here," she tapped a paper with one finger, "this is compound interest calculated monthly instead of annually. That's not standard practice for a homestead loan. That's exploitation. You're saying Grover's been cheating me. I'm saying Grover's been doing exactly what predatory lenders do to men who don't understand the fine print. Whether that constitutes cheating depends on what the law allows, and I don't know Montana Territory law well enough yet to say. But I know enough to say this isn't right." Caleb felt something hot rise up in his chest, not at her, but at Grover, at the bank, at every polite, cold conversation he'd had in that office, believing he was simply a man who'd fallen behind when the truth might have been that the game had been rigged from the start. "Can you prove it?" he asked. "Given time, yes. Given 19 days. She paused, doing the math again, her lips pressing into a thin line. 18 days now. I can try." "And if you can't," she looked up at him then, and for the first time he saw something other than sharp assessment in her eyes. He saw a flicker of the same fear he carried himself, the fear of a person who'd staked everything on being competent enough to outrun disaster. "Then we lose the land?" she said plainly. "But we'll lose it having tried everything instead of having done nothing but hope." "That's more than most folks would offer a stranger's problem, ma'am. It's not your problem anymore, Mr. Mason." She looked back down at the papers, picking up his broken ledger and beginning methodically to rebuild it from the beginning. "I married into it, which means whether either of us likes it, it's mine as much as yours now." He didn't sleep well that night. He lay in the small room he'd claimed off the kitchen, listening to the creak of the house settling, and thought about the woman in the next room. A stranger, sharp-tongued, sharper-minded, who'd stepped off a stagecoach that morning, and already knew more about his finances than he did. He thought about Petayero's voice in the square. Poor thing don't even know what she's walking into. He wondered now if that had been backward. If it wasn't Evelyn who didn't know what she was walking into. If it was him. He woke before dawn, out of habit dressed, and walked into the kitchen, expecting to start the coffee himself, same as every morning since his mother passed. Evelyn was already there. She'd lit the stove. She had coffee going. And spread across the table in neat, precise columns that hadn't existed the night before was a fully rebuilt ledger. Every debt accounted for, every payment tracked, a red line drawn beneath a final number that made Caleb's stomach drop. $320 is what the bank claims you owe, she said, not looking up from the page she was still writing on. But according to my calculations, factoring out the improperly compounded interest Grover's been charging you, the actual debt, if calculated fairly, is closer to 210. Caleb stared at the number. "You did all this since last night?" asked. "I don't sleep well in unfamiliar houses." She finally looked up at him, and there was something steady in her gaze, something that hadn't been there the day before. Not softness, not yet, but the beginning of something that looked almost like partnership. "I also don't like starting a fight without knowing exactly what I'm fighting." "You're already fighting for me. We've been married less than a day. I'm not fighting for you, Mr. Mason." She closed the ledger, stood, and looked him dead in the eye, with a steadiness that made him understand for the first time exactly what kind of woman had stepped off that stagecoach. "I'm fighting because a man tried to cheat someone, and I have never once in my life let that happen in front of me without doing something about it." She picked up her coffee, walked past him toward the door, and paused only once, her hand on the frame. "Now," she said, "show me the rest of this land. If I'm going to save it, I need to see exactly what I'm saving." Caleb stood there a moment longer, looking at the ledger on the table, the red line beneath the number, the neat handwriting that had rebuilt in one sleepless night what he'd failed to organize in years. He'd sent for a wife to tend chickens. He was starting to understand he'd gotten something else entirely, something he didn't yet have a word for, something that scared him more than the bank ever had. Caleb led her out past the coop, past the barn, with its ruined roof, out to the fence line that marked where Mason land ended and empty grass began. He watched her walk it the way another man might walk a battlefield, taking stock, saying nothing, her boots sinking into dirt that hadn't seen a decent rain in a month. "How many head of cattle?" she asked. 11? 11. She said the number like it tasted bad. "For 200 acres. Used to be 40. Bank took most of them last spring when I fell behind. So they've already been paid in effect. Twice over if the interest calculations I found last night are accurate." She turned to look at him. "Did you know that?" "I knew I lost the cattle. I didn't do the arithmetic on what it meant." "That's the problem, Mr. Mason. You keep not doing the arithmetic, and the arithmetic keeps punishing you for it." He felt his jaw tighten the way it always did when she said something true that he didn't want to hear. "I've been a little occupied trying to keep the roof over both our heads, ma'am. I understand that. I'm not criticizing your effort. I'm criticizing your ignorance." She said it plainly, without cruelty, the way she seemed to say everything like a fact laid on a table, take it or leave it. Effort without information is just exhaustion, Mr. Mason. You've been exhausting yourself for years and calling it survival. He didn't have an answer for that. He wasn't sure there was one. They walked on toward the coop, and the closer they got, the more his stomach turned. 3 more birds dead since yesterday morning, stiff in the dust, the smell of it already starting to turn sour in the summer heat. Evelyn crouched down again, the same way she had the day before, turning one over in her bare hands, without flinching. He noticed that about her already, she didn't flinch. Not from dead birds, not from bad news, not from him. "This isn't just the feed anymore," she said. "What do you mean?" "I mean the molds had time to work through the flock. Look here." She held the bird up slightly, showing him something he wouldn't have known to look for. "The others that are still alive, how many are eating normally?" "Half, maybe less." "Then we've got maybe 3 days before this kills the rest of them, unless we change the feed today." "I don't have money for new feed, ma'am. That's rather the whole problem. I didn't say buy new feed. I said change it." She stood wiping her hands on her skirt without ceremony. "What else do you have?" "Garden scraps, grain from a neighbor. Anything dry. I got a garden gone half to weed. There's greens in there still good." "Then we start there. And we clean out this coop today. All of it. Every bit of old feed and old bedding, because if we don't, we're just going to keep poisoning whatever's left." He looked at her. This woman in a traveling dress, not built for farm labor, already rolling her sleeves up past her elbows without being asked. "Ma'am, you don't have to." "Mr. Mason." She cut him off, not unkindly, but with a finality that told him arguing would be a waste of both their time. "I told you yesterday I don't come from nothing. I come from wherever the work is. Right now the work is here." They cleaned the coop together in the rising heat of the morning, and Caleb found himself stealing glances at her more than he meant to, not out of romance, not yet, but out of something closer to disbelief. She worked like she'd done it before, or like she refused to let her body admit she hadn't her hands steady, even when her breath went short, her jaw set, even when sweat soaked through the collar of her dress. "You don't talk much when you work," he said, mostly to break the silence. "Neither do you." I talk plenty, just not usually to folks who correct my arithmetic in front of half the town. That got something out of her, not quite a laugh, but close. A short exhale through her nose gone as fast as it came. You should be thanking me for that correction, Mr. Mason. It saved you 2 days you didn't know you had. I'll thank you once we've still got a homestead standing in 18 days. 17, she said. It's past noon. He shot her a look, and this time there was no mistaking it. The corner of her mouth twitched, just barely, before she smoothed it back into that composed, unreadable expression she seemed to wear like armor. You do that on purpose, he said. Do what? Correct me, just to see if I'll bite. I correct you because you're wrong, Mr. Mason. Whether you bite is your own business. He laughed. Actually laughed the first time in longer than he could remember, and something in her face flickered at the sound of it. Surprise, maybe? Or something else he couldn't name yet. By the time they'd finished with the coop, the sun was dropping low and orange over the ridge, and Caleb's back ached in a way that told him he'd worked harder that day than he had in weeks. Not because the labor itself was heavier, but because he hadn't been doing it alone. And something about not being alone made him push himself further, like he had something to prove. Tomorrow, Evelyn said, drying her hands on a rag. I want to go into town. What for? I need to speak with the bank directly. If Grover's been compounding interest illegally, I want to see the original loan documents, not just your copies. I want to compare the numbers. Caleb felt something cold settle in his gut. Ma'am, Grover ain't going to hand over his own paperwork to a woman he's never met. He won't have a choice. I'm your wife now. That makes his business my business legally, whether he likes it or not. You sure about that? I'm sure about very little in this territory, Mr. Mason. But I know contract law, and I know how to make a man very uncomfortable with the questions I ask. Trust me on this. He wanted to argue. Some old stubborn part of him wanted to tell her that this was his fight, his land, his debt, and she'd been here less than 2 days and had no business marching into Grover's bank like she owned the place. But another part of him, a newer part, one that had woken up somewhere between the dead chickens and the ledger she'd rebuilt overnight, told him to shut his mouth and let her try. All right, he said. We'll go together. I didn't ask for company. Didn't say you did. I'm coming anyway. She studied him for a long moment, like she was recalculating something. Why? Because whatever you find in there, ma'am, it's going to affect both of us. And because I ain't in the habit of sending a woman into a fight alone, even one who don't need my help. Something shifted in her face, then small, almost imperceptible but real. Fine, she said. But let me do the talking. Ma'am, I wasn't planning on saying much of anything. Good. Keep it that way. They rode into Cutter's Notch the next morning, and word had already spread the way it always did in a town too small to keep secrets. Half the street seemed to find some reason to be standing outside the mercantile or the church watching the Mason wagon roll past with open curiosity. There she is, someone murmured. The Boston bride. Heard she corrected Petayero's arithmetic right there in the square. Heard she's already rebuilding his books. Caleb kept his eyes forward, jaw tight, the way he always did when the town's whispers turned to him. Evelyn beside him didn't seem to hear them at all, or if she did, she gave no sign of it. Her spine straight, her hands folded, her focus entirely on the bank at the end of the street. Grover was waiting for them, before they'd even hitched the wagon, standing in the doorway of the bank with that same thin smile he always wore, the one that never quite reached his eyes. Mr. Mason, he said. And you must be the new Mrs. Mason. Word travels fast in a town this size. Evelyn Carter, she said, not offering the correction he might have expected. Not yet, a Mrs. Mason. In her own mind, Caleb noted, though she let the title stand for now. I'd like to see the original loan documents for my husband's account. Grover's smile flickered just slightly. That's not typically how we handle these matters, ma'am. I'm not asking how you typically handle matters, Mr. Grover. I'm asking to see the documents. As Mr. Mason's wife, I have every legal right to review the terms of a debt that now affects my household. With respect, ma'am, these are complex financial instruments. I'm not sure a woman. Evelyn finished for him, and her voice, though calm, carried an edge sharp enough to cut. I spent 8 years managing accounts for the Boston Mercantile Trust, Mr. Grover. I've read loan documents considerably more complex than whatever you've drawn up for a 200-acre homestead. I assure you I'm capable of understanding them. Grover's jaw tightened. Caleb watched it happen. Watched the moment the banker realized he wasn't dealing with a woman he could dismiss with a smile and a pat explanation. Very well, Grover said finally. Step into my office. The office was small, tidy, everything in its place. The way Caleb imagined a man like Grover kept everything in his life controlled, ordered nothing left to chance. Evelyn sat across from him without waiting to be offered a chair, and when Grover slid the loan documents across the desk, she didn't touch them right away. She simply looked at them, then at him. These are copies, she said. They're accurate copies. I didn't ask if they were accurate. I asked if they were copies. I'd like to see the originals with your bank's seal, not a clerk's transcription. Grover's smile thinned further. The originals are kept in the vault, ma'am. It's not standard practice to, Mr. Grover. Evelyn's voice didn't rise, but something in it sharpened the way a blade sharpens without getting louder. I've already found 3 discrepancies in the interest calculations on the copy you've given my husband over the past 6 months. I'd like to know whether those discrepancies exist in the original documents, or whether they were introduced somewhere in the copying process. Now you can retrieve the originals for me, or I can retrieve a territorial auditor from the county seat, who will ask you the same question with considerably less patience than I'm currently showing. The room went very quiet. Caleb, sitting beside her, found himself holding his breath, watching Grover's face for the flicker he was sure would come. It came. Just a fraction of a second, a tightening around the eyes, a stillness in his hands that hadn't been there before, but Caleb saw it, and he knew Evelyn saw it too. I'll need to consult with the bank's president, Grover said finally. Please do, Evelyn said, standing, smoothing her skirt with the same brisk efficiency she brought to everything. We'll return in 3 days for the originals, and Mr. Grover. She paused at the door, looking back at him with an expression that gave nothing away. If those discrepancies exist in the originals, and it turns out you've been compounding interest improperly on my husband's loan, I'll expect a revised balance reflecting the actual debt, not the inflated one. And if I refuse, then I suppose we'll find out together whether Montana Territory has laws against predatory lending, and whether a man in your position wants that question asked publicly. She walked out without waiting for his answer, and Caleb followed her, feeling something close to awe settle in his chest. Awe and something else, something warmer. Something he didn't have a name for yet, but felt anyway, watching her walk down that boardwalk like she'd just won a war instead of a single skirmish. You think he's hiding something? Caleb asked once they were out of earshot. I know he's hiding something. The question is how much and whether we can prove it before your 19 days. 16, he corrected, and this time it was his turn to feel something like satisfaction at the small, surprised look she gave him. 16, she agreed. Before your 16 days run out. They didn't get far past the mercantile before Peta Yarrow appeared, seemingly from nowhere, the way she always seemed to materialize whenever there was gossip to be had. Mrs. Mason, she said, the title dripping with false sweetness. I do hope you're settling in. Ranch life can be a terrible shock for a city girl. I'm managing, Evelyn said, not breaking stride. Of course, though I imagine it's quite the adjustment going from a bank in Boston to a dying homestead out here. Peta's eyes flicked to Caleb, something cruel and satisfied in them. Caleb's had such bad luck with that land. His father before him, too. Some say the ground itself is cursed. I don't believe in curses, Mrs. Yarrow, Evelyn said. I believe in mismanagement, which is considerably easier to fix. Peta's smile faltered. Now, if you'll excuse us, Evelyn continued. We have 16 days to fix a great deal of mismanagement, and I'd rather not waste any of them standing in the street." She walked on, and Caleb had to fight to keep the grin off his face as he followed Pedillero left standing there, with her mouth slightly open, robbed of whatever cutting remark she'd been planning to deliver next. "You made an enemy today," he said once they were clear. "I made an enemy the moment I stepped off that stagecoach, Mr. Mason. Women like her decide who they hate before they've even said hello. I simply gave her a reason that's actually true." "You don't seem too bothered by it. I've dealt with women like Pedillero my whole life. In Boston, in the banking house, everywhere I've ever worked. They're never bothered by competence in a man. They're always bothered by it in a woman." She glanced at him, something almost gentle in her expression for the first time since she'd arrived. "You didn't flinch back there, when I spoke to Grover the way I did." "Why would I flinch? You were right. Most men flinch when their wife proves smarter than the men they're negotiating with. It bruises something." "Ma'am, my pride's been bruised so many times these last few years, I don't reckon I've got much left to protect. Watching you take Grover apart piece by piece was about the best thing I've seen happen on this trip." She didn't answer that, but something in her shoulders eased just slightly. And for the rest of the ride home, the silence between them felt different than it had before. Not the silence of two strangers, but something closer to the quiet of two people who'd just fought the same fight and won. That easier feeling didn't last long. They returned to Mason Ridge to find 4 more birds dead, and this time it wasn't the feed. "Something got in," Caleb said, crouching by the coop, examining the torn wire at the base of the fence. "Coyote maybe, or a bobcat coming down off the ridge." "Can we fix the fence?" "I can fix the fence. Takes time and wire I don't have money to buy more of." Evelyn was already walking the perimeter, examining the damage with the same clinical focus she brought to everything. "This wasn't dug from below," she said. "Look at the angle of the wire. It's been pulled apart, not burrowed under." Caleb came to stand beside her, following her gaze. She was right. The wire wasn't torn, the way an animal would tear it digging up from beneath. It had been pulled outward, bent back, with what looked like deliberate hands. "You're saying someone did this. I'm saying it's possible. I don't have enough information to say it's certain." "Who'd want to kill my chickens? Who benefits if you lose this land in 16 days? The question hung there between them, and Caleb felt something cold slide down his spine as the pieces started to align in a way he didn't like. "Grover," he said, "or someone working for him. I don't know yet. But it's worth considering that a man who's been overcharging you on interest for 6 months might not be above other methods of ensuring you default." "That's a serious accusation, ma'am." "It's a serious situation, Mr. Mason. I'd rather consider every possibility than be blindsided by one I refuse to look at." They repaired the fence as best they could that evening, using scrap wire from the barn and rope where the wire ran out, and Caleb found himself glancing toward the tree line more than once, wondering for the first time since he'd bought this land, whether the danger threatening it wore a human face. The days that followed fell into a rhythm neither of them had expected, but both seemed to accept without much discussion. Caleb worked the land fences, the barn roof, what cattle they had left, while Evelyn split her time between the flock and the ledgers, rebuilding his finances, with the same relentless precision she'd shown that first sleepless night. They argued, often. "You're spending money we don't have," Caleb said one evening, watching her count out coins for feed from the small store of cash he kept hidden in a tin behind the stove. "I'm spending money strategically. There's a difference." "Feels the same from where I'm standing." "That's because you've never run a business, Mr. Mason. You've only ever run a farm. A farm survives day to day. A business survives by understanding that some expenses today prevent larger losses tomorrow. If we don't buy proper feed now, we lose the rest of the flock, and then we have no eggs to sell, no birds to slaughter, and no income at all going into winter. And if Grover forecloses before winter, none of that matters anyway. Which is precisely why I'm also spending 3 hours a day going through every scrap of paper in this house looking for proof of what he's done. I'm not choosing between fixing the flock and fighting Grover, Mr. Mason. I'm doing both because giving up on either one guarantees we lose." He didn't have an answer for that. He rarely did when she spoke like that with a certainty that made his own doubts feel small and unpracticed by comparison. "You ever wrong about anything?" he asked, half joking, half genuinely curious. "Frequently. I was wrong about Boston. I was wrong about a great many things there." Something shadowed crossed her face, gone as quickly as it came. "I try not to be wrong about numbers. Numbers at least don't lie to you the way people do." He wanted to ask what she meant, wanted to ask about Boston, about whatever had sent a woman with her skills and her sharpness across the country to marry a stranger sight unseen, but something in her expression told him this wasn't the night for that question, and he let it go. The storm hit on the 9th day, rolling down off the mountains with a violence that Caleb had seen before, but never quite gotten used to. Black clouds, swallowing the ridge wind, bending the trees sideways, rain coming down so hard, it felt like the sky itself had turned against them. "Get the birds inside!" Caleb shouted, already running for the coop, the wind nearly tearing his hat from his head. Evelyn was right behind him, skirts soaked through in seconds, hair plastered to her face, hauling crates without waiting to be told what to do. "How bad is this going to get?" she yelled over the wind. "Bad. Get what you can and get back to the house." They worked side by side in the driving rain, hauling birds, hauling feed, doing everything they could to save what little they had left, and by the time the worst of it passed, they were both soaked to the bone, exhausted, and standing in what remained of the coop's roof, now half collapsed under the weight of the storm. "We lost 6. Caleb said, his voice hollow, looking at what the wind and rain had left behind. 6 more. Evelyn didn't say anything at first. She stood beside him, staring at the wreckage, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Caleb saw something crack in that composed exterior. Not tears, not quite, but something close, something raw beneath the surface. "This isn't your fault," she said quietly, and he wasn't sure if she was talking to him or to herself. "Feels like it is." "It's not. A storm isn't mismanagement, Mr. Mason. It's just bad luck arriving at the worst possible time." She turned to look at him, rain still dripping from her chin. "We rebuild the roof tomorrow. Tonight we salvage what's left, and we don't waste time grieving what we can't change." "You don't ever stop, do you?" "I stopped once." Her voice went quieter, tighter, like the words cost her something to say. "It cost me everything I had. I don't intend to make that mistake again." He wanted to ask. He wanted to know what stopping once had meant, what it had cost her, what ghost she was outrunning all the way from Boston to a dying homestead in Montana territory. But the rain was still falling, and the birds still needed tending, and there was a particular kind of intimacy in not asking and letting her keep whatever door she'd closed shut a little longer. "All right," he said instead. "Tomorrow we rebuild." They didn't get the chance. The next morning, before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, a rider came up the road at a pace that told Caleb something was wrong before the man had even reached the yard. It was Tobias Hale, the young clerk from the telegraph office. His horse lathered, his face pale. "Mr. Mason," he said, breathless. "Grover's called an emergency meeting of the bank's board. He's saying the storm damage proves the property's a bad risk. He's asking to move up the foreclosure date." Caleb felt the ground shift beneath him. "Move it up to when?" 5 days, Tobias said. "He wants the debt settled in 5 days, or the bank takes the land immediate." The number hung in the air between them, and Caleb felt something in his chest cave in. Not the anger from before. Not even despair, but something closer to raw, unfiltered fear. 5 days. "That's not legal," Evelyn said, stepping forward, her voice sharper than Caleb had heard it since they'd arrived. "A loan agreement has fixed terms. He can't simply move the deadline because of a storm." "There's a clause?" Tobias said, apologetic, clearly uncomfortable being the one to deliver this news. "In the original contract, something about property condition affecting collateral value." "I don't understand all of it, ma'am, but Grover's lawyer says it gives him the right." Evelyn's jaw tightened, and for a long moment she said nothing, her mind clearly working through implications faster than either man beside her could follow. "I need to see that clause," she said finally. "Today. Grover said he'd meet with you both tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock at the bank." "Tomorrow's too late if he's already moved the deadline." "It's the earliest he'll agree to, ma'am. I'm sorry." Tobias rode off, leaving the two of them standing in the wreckage of the storm, staring at a roof that needed rebuilding and a deadline that had just been cut by more than half. 5 days, Caleb said mostly to himself. "We're not losing this land in 5 days," Evelyn said. And there was something in her voice now that Caleb hadn't heard before, not just confidence, but something closer to fury, controlled and precise, aimed like a blade at a target she hadn't fully seen yet, but fully intended to cut down. "You sound awful certain for a woman who just found out the rules changed overnight." "The rules didn't change, Mr. Mason. Grover changed them because he thinks a storm-damaged farm and a woman from Boston are easy targets." She turned to look at him. Rain-soaked hair, exhausted eyes, and something underneath it all that burned steady and unshaken. "He doesn't know me yet, but he's about to." That night, she didn't sleep. Caleb knew because he heard her moving in the kitchen long after midnight, the soft scratch of pen on paper, the occasional rustle of documents being sorted and resorted. He got up around 2 in the morning, unable to sleep himself, and found her exactly where he expected at the table, surrounded by every scrap of paper from his loan, her eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion, but sharp as ever. "You should rest," he said. "I will, after I find what I'm looking for." "What are you looking for?" She looked up at him, and for the first time, he saw something like triumph flickering behind the exhaustion. "The property condition clause Tobias mentioned. I found it. And it's not what Grover claims it is." She turned the document toward him, tapping a paragraph near the bottom of the page. "This clause allows the bank to reassess collateral value if the property suffers damage that reduces its worth by more than 20%. A damaged coop roof doesn't come close to that threshold. Grover's lawyer is either lying to him or Grover's lying to us. Can you prove that?" "I can calculate the actual value of the storm damage against the total assessed value of the property. If I'm right, and I believe I am, the damage doesn't come anywhere near 20%, which means Grover has no legal grounds to move up the deadline." "Then why's he doing it?" Evelyn's expression darkened. "Because he doesn't expect anyone to check his math, Mr. Mason. He's been getting away with it for years on you, and probably on other families in this territory. He didn't expect someone who checks math for a living to marry into the one debt he thought was easiest to collect." Caleb sat down across from her, feeling something settle in his chest that he hadn't felt in longer than he could remember. Not quite hope, not yet, but something adjacent to it, something that had been buried under years of grief and debt and a mountain that never seemed to give a man a break. "You're going to beat him," he said. "Tomorrow, aren't you?" "I'm going to try." She met his eyes, and there was no arrogance in it, just plain, unshaken resolve. "Trying is all I ever promised you, Mr. Mason. But I intend to try harder than Elias Grover has ever had to work for anything in his life." The meeting the next morning didn't go the way Grover expected. He sat behind his desk with the same thin smile, flanked by a lawyer Caleb didn't recognize, clearly prepared to steamroll a rancher and his new bride with legal language neither of them would understand. He hadn't accounted for Evelyn laying out 3 documents on his desk before he'd even finished his opening remarks. "Before we begin," she said, "I'd like to discuss the collateral value clause you're using to justify moving the foreclosure deadline." Grover's smile flickered. "Mrs. Mason, this is a complex legal matter." "It's a mathematical matter," Mr. Grover dressed up as a legal one. "The clause requires damage reducing property value by more than 20%. I've calculated the storm damage against the assessed value of the homestead using the bank's own assessment records from last year." She slid the paper across the desk. "The damage comes to approximately 4%, nowhere close to your threshold." The lawyer beside Grover leaned over, scanning the numbers, and Caleb watched something uncomfortable pass between the two men, a look that told him Evelyn had caught them in exactly the lie she'd suspected. There may be additional damage not yet assessed, Grover said, recovering quickly. Then have your own assessor examine the property at the bank's expense, and if the damage truly exceeds 20%, I'll accept your revised deadline without complaint. But until then, the original terms stand. 21 days from the initial notice, which gives us until... She glanced at a small calendar she'd brought with her. 11 days remaining, not 5. Grover's jaw tightened, the same flicker of controlled fury Caleb had seen once before. You're very confident for a woman who arrived in this territory less than 2 weeks ago. I'm confident because I'm right, Mr. Grover. Confidence built on accurate calculation isn't arrogance. It's simply preparation. She stood gathering her papers with the same brisk efficiency she brought to everything. We'll expect your assessor within the week if you intend to dispute my numbers. Otherwise, we'll see you in 11 days with the original debt settled. Not the inflated figure your compounding interest created, but the accurate one. They walked out of that office with Grover still sitting there, jaw tight, saying nothing, and Caleb felt something rise in his chest that he hadn't let himself feel in years. Something that felt dangerously close to hope. But hope in Caleb's experience never lasted long without something coming to test it. They were 3 days out from the new deadline when Tobias came riding up to the ranch again, his face even paler than before. Mr. Mason, he said, there's something you need to see, in town. It's about the property records. What about them? Grover's filed a new claim. Says there's a lien on the land from before you bought it, says your father owed money to a man named Silas Pratt, and the debt was never settled. Says it gives the bank priority claim over anything you might pay toward the current loan. Caleb felt the ground drop out from under him for the second time in a week. That's a lie. My father never owed anyone named Pratt. I don't know if it's true or not, Mr. Mason. I just know Grover's filed it with the county, and it's going to complicate things considerable. Evelyn was already moving toward the wagon, her face set in the same hard, focused expression she wore whenever a new fight presented itself. Get the wagon, she said. We need to see this filing ourselves, today. Ma'am, it's already past noon. Then we ride fast, Mr. Mason. Because if Grover's fabricating debts out of thin air, I intend to prove it before he can use it to take this land out from under us in 3 days. Caleb looked at her, soaked from the storm 3 days before, exhausted from sleepless nights over ledgers still standing here, fighting a battle that wasn't even hers by birth, only by marriage, only by choice. And something in his chest tightened with a feeling he didn't have a name for yet. Something that went beyond gratitude, beyond respect. All right, he said, grabbing his hat. Let's go prove him wrong. They rode into town with the sun dropping low behind them. 11 days become 8. 8 about to become something far more complicated, and neither of them knowing yet just how deep Elias Grover's lies went, or how much more they'd have to fight before this land was truly theirs. The county recorder's office sat at the far end of Main Street, a squat brick building that always smelled of dust and old paper, and Caleb felt his pulse hammering by the time they hitched the wagon outside it. Evelyn was already down before he'd set the brake skirts gathered, moving toward the door, with the same unshaken purpose she'd carried into Grover's bank 3 days before. The clerk inside, an older man named Whitfield, with spectacles perched low on his nose, looked up when the bell over the door rang, and something in his face shifted the moment he recognized them. Mr. Mason, he said carefully. Mrs. Mason, I imagine you're here about the filing. We are, Evelyn said. I'd like to see it. The original, not a summary. Whitfield hesitated, glancing toward the back room, like he expected someone to emerge from it before he finally reached beneath the counter and produced a thin folder. This came in yesterday afternoon, he said. Filed by Mr. Grover's lawyer on behalf of a claim held by a Silas Pratt, dated, he squinted at the paper, dated 11 years back. Debt of $200 owed by your father, Mr. Mason, secured against the property. Caleb felt something twist in his gut, hard and sour. My father never borrowed from any man named Pratt. I'd have known. Would you have? Evelyn asked, not unkindly, already reaching for the document. You were how old 11 years ago? 14. Then it's possible your father had dealings you weren't privy to. I'm not saying the debt is real, Mr. Mason. I'm saying we need to prove it isn't, and assuming it's a lie without evidence won't help us do that." She spread the paper flat on the counter, and Caleb watched her eyes move across it, the way they'd moved across his ledgers that first sleepless night, quick, precise cataloging every line, every signature, every date. "This is wrong," she said after a moment. "Wrong how?" "The date. It's dated the 14th of March 11 years ago. But look at the ink." She tilted the page toward the window where the afternoon light caught the surface of the paper. "This ink hasn't faded the way 11-year-old ink fades. Compare it to the loan documents from your own file, Mr. Mason, your father's signature from around that same period." Caleb didn't have to be told twice. He pulled his own copy of an old receipt from his coat, something he'd carried since sorting through his father's things after the funeral, and set it beside the Pratt document. The difference was plain, even to his untrained eye. His father's old signature had gone brown and faded soft at the edges. The signature on the Pratt document was darker, crisper, like it had been written far more recently than 11 years ago. "That's not my father's ink," he said slowly. "That's not even close." "Mr. Whitfield," Evelyn said, turning to the clerk, her voice sharpening. "Who witnessed this filing?" Whitfield's face had gone pale. I don't recall offhand, ma'am." "You recall well enough. I can see it on your face. Who witnessed it?" The clerk glanced toward the door again, lowering his voice like he was afraid the walls themselves might carry word back to Grover. It was notarized by Grover's own lawyer. No independent witness. "That's not standard procedure for a lien claim of this size, is it?" "No, ma'am, it ain't." "Thank you, Mr. Whitfield." Evelyn straightened, gathering the document with careful hands, like she was holding evidence in a trial that hadn't started yet, but soon would. "I'd like a certified copy of this filing, and I'd like the date and time stamped on your request log, so there's a record that we identified this discrepancy today before Mr. Grover has a chance to alter anything further." Whitfield nodded quickly, already reaching for his stamp, eager to have them gone before whatever storm was building broke over his own head. They left the recorder's office with the copy folded carefully inside Evelyn's coat, and Caleb felt something hot and furious rising in his chest, a feeling he hadn't let himself feel in years, not grief, not exhaustion, but plain, unfiltered anger. "He's inventing debts," he said. "My father's been dead 6 years, and that son of a bitch is inventing debts against a dead man to steal what's left." "We don't know that yet," Evelyn said, though her voice had none of its usual calm certainty. "We know the document looks suspicious. We need to find Silas Pratt." "You think he's real?" "I think someone signed that name. Whether Silas Pratt is a real man who's being used without his knowledge, or a name invented entirely, I don't know. But there's a way to find out." "How?" "We ask around. A debt of $200 11 years old, someone in this town remembers if a man named Pratt ever lived here." They found their answer faster than either of them expected, and it came from the last place Caleb thought to look. The old woman ran the boarding house at the edge of town, a woman named Ruth Calloway, who'd lived in Cutter's Notch longer than anyone still breathing, and when Evelyn asked her gently whether she remembered a man named Silas Pratt, something flickered across the old woman's face that told them they'd found the right door to knock on. "Silas Pratt," Ruth repeated slowly, settling into her rocking chair with the careful deliberation of someone choosing her words. "Now, there's a name I haven't heard spoke in some years." "You knew him?" Caleb asked. "Knew him well enough. Prospector mostly. Came through here on and off for years, never stayed long, never had 2 coins to rub together most of the time." Ruth's eyes sharpened, fixing on Evelyn with something like suspicion. "Why's a fine lady like you asking after a dead man?" Caleb felt his stomach drop. "Dead?" "Been dead near 4 years now, son. Died up in the high camp, some kind of fever. I remember because there wasn't nobody to bury him, proper had to take up a collection in town just to see him in the ground decent." Evelyn went very still beside him, and Caleb watched her mind working, turning the information over like she was fitting pieces into a puzzle only she could see the shape of. "Mrs. Calloway," she said carefully. Did Silas Pratt ever mention lending money to a man named Mason, or to anyone in this valley? Ruth laughed a dry, humorless sound. Silas Pratt never had 2 coins to lend anybody, ma'am. Man drank whatever he earned faster than he earned it. If somebody's telling you Silas Pratt lent out $200 to anybody, they're lying to your face and lying badly at that. The silence that followed felt like the moment right before a lightning strike, the air gone thick and heavy with what they'd just learned. "He's dead 4 years," Caleb said slowly. "And the lien claims he lent my father money 11 years ago, which means either the debt is real and predates his death by 7 years, making it entirely possible." Evelyn's voice had gone tight, controlled the way it did when she was fighting to keep her fury from spilling over. "Or the entire claim is fabricated, filed against a dead man's name because a dead man can't stand up in court to deny it." "You think it's Grover. I think Elias Grover found a convenient dead man with no family left in this territory to dispute a claim, and used his name to manufacture a debt against your father that never existed." She turned to Ruth, her expression softening slightly. "Mrs. Calloway, would you be willing to state what you've told us formally, if it came to that? To a judge or a territorial official?" Ruth's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Caleb thought she might refuse. Might decide, like so many in this town, that it was safer to stay quiet than to cross a man like Grover. "I buried that boy myself, near enough," she said instead, her voice hardening. "Took up the collection when nobody else in this town would spare a coin for a dead prospector. I'll be damned if I let some banker use his good name to steal a dying man's land 4 years after he's in the ground." She looked at Caleb, something almost maternal in her gaze. "Your father was a decent man, Caleb Mason. Paid his debts honest, every one I ever heard of. I'll say what I know, and I'll say it to whoever needs to hear it." Something in Caleb's chest cracked open at that, not grief exactly, but something adjacent to it, a rawness he hadn't let himself feel since the funeral 6 years back. "Thank you," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he meant it to. They rode back toward Mason Ridge with the sun sinking low, and neither of them spoke for a long while, the weight of what they'd learned settling over the wagon like a held breath. "We have a witness," Caleb said finally. "We have proof the ink's wrong. We can beat this. We have a witness who can testify Pratt was a poor prospector, unlikely to have $200 to lend. We have suspicious ink on a document. That's not proof, Mr. Mason. Not the kind that stands up in a territorial hearing against a banker with a lawyer and a filed claim." Evelyn's jaw was tight, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. "It's a start. It's not enough." "Then what is enough?" "I don't know yet, but I intend to find out before your 8 days become nothing." They crested the last hill toward the ranch as the light was failing, and Caleb felt the familiar tightness return to his chest, the one that came every time he looked at what remained of his father's land, now compounded by everything they'd learned that day. Then he saw the smoke. "Evelyn." She'd already seen it, already gone rigid beside him, and Caleb didn't wait for the wagon to fully stop before he was down and running, boots hitting hard-packed dirt, his heart slamming against his ribs. The barn. Flames licked up one corner of it, orange against the darkening sky, and Caleb felt something close to panic seize his chest as he sprinted toward it, already calculating what was inside, what little feed they had left, the tools, the small store of lumber he'd been saving to fix the coop roof. "Water," he shouted. "Evelyn, get water, the trough by the—" "I see it." They fought the fire together, hauling buckets from the trough in a frantic, desperate rhythm. Caleb's arms burning with the effort, Evelyn beside him, matching him bucket for bucket, despite her exhaustion, despite the long day they'd already had. It took nearly an hour to beat it back, and by the time the flames finally died to smoking embers, Caleb stood there soaked in sweat and trough water, staring at the scorched corner of the barn with a fury that threatened to swallow him whole. "This wasn't lightning," he said. "No storm tonight. No reason for a fire to start on its own." Evelyn crouched near the base of the burn, examining the ground the way she examined everything methodical even in the middle of chaos. "There," she said, pointing. "Kerosene. You can smell it even now. This was set. Grover. I can't prove that, not yet. But someone wanted this barn burned tonight, the same night we discovered the Pratt claim is likely fraudulent. That's not a coincidence I'm willing to accept, Mr. Mason. Caleb felt something shift inside him. Not just anger now, but something colder, harder. Fear, maybe, but fear transformed into something with teeth. They're trying to scare us off, he said, or trying to make sure we don't live long enough to prove what we found today. Evelyn stood, her face pale in the dim light, but her voice steady despite it. Which means we're closer to the truth than I realized. Men don't burn barns over lies that don't matter. They didn't sleep that night. Caleb kept watch from the porch with his father's old rifle across his knees, and Evelyn sat beside him for a long while, wrapped in a blanket against the night chill, neither of them speaking until the silence itself became too heavy to bear. You should go inside, he said. Get some rest. I'll watch. I'm not tired. You're exhausted. I can see it. I'm too afraid to be tired, she said, and something in her voice cracked slightly. The composed exterior slipping just enough to let something raw show through. I've never had someone try to burn down something I was fighting for. Not like this. Caleb looked over at her at the fear she was trying so hard to control, and felt something in his chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. You don't have to be part of this, he said quietly. You could take the money we've got left. Go back east, find somewhere safer than a homestead. Some bankers willing to burn down to steal. Is that what you want? No. The word came out faster than he meant it, to rougher, more honest than he'd planned. That's about the last thing I want, Evelyn. But I ain't in the habit of asking a woman to risk her life for land that was never hers to begin with. She was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkened yard, the smell of smoke still hanging faint in the air. It's mine now, she said finally. Whether it started that way or not. I don't run from things, Caleb. Not since... She stopped herself, jaw tightening. Not since what? She didn't answer right away, and he thought maybe she wouldn't. Thought maybe this was another door she'd close before he could see through it. But then quietly, in a voice stripped of all its usual armor, she started to talk. I told you I worked for a bank in Boston. 8 years. I was good at it, better than good. I found discrepancies nobody else caught, built systems that saved the bank thousands. My employer, a man named Harlan Voss, used to say I had the finest mind for numbers he'd ever seen in a clerk, man or woman. Her voice went flat, careful the way it did when she was holding something back by sheer force of will. 3 years ago, I discovered he was embezzling from client accounts. Small amounts, spread across dozens of accounts, disguised in the kind of complexity only someone like me would ever untangle. What did you do? I reported it to the bank's directors with full documentation, certain they'd see the truth and remove him. Her laugh was bitter, humorless. Instead, they believed him when he told them I'd falsified the records myself out of some petty jealousy over a promotion I'd been passed over for. He'd been there 15 years. I'd been there 8. It was easier to believe the loyal man than the woman with the uncomfortable truth. They fired you. They ruined me. No bank in Boston would hire a woman accused of falsifying records regardless of whether the accusation was ever proven. Harlan Voss kept his position, kept his reputation. I lost everything I'd spent 8 years building over a truth I never should have told. She turned to look at him, and in the dim light, Caleb could see something raw and unguarded in her eyes for the first time since she'd stepped off that stagecoach. That's why I answered your wire, Mr. Mason. Not for romance, not even entirely for survival. I wanted somewhere no one knew my name, where I could start proving my worth again without some man deciding my truth was less believable than his lies. Caleb sat with that for a long moment, feeling the weight of it settle between them, understanding finally why she fought Grover with such ferocity, why fraud and dishonest men seemed to strike something in her far deeper than simple professional outrage. He never faced anything for it, Caleb said. This Voss fella, not that I know of. Last I heard, he'd been promoted again. Her jaw tightened, and for a moment the fury Caleb had seen her aim at Grover flickered behind her eyes, aimed now at a memory 3,000 miles away. Which is precisely why I refuse to let Elias Grover walk away with your land the way Harlan Voss walked away with my reputation. Some men only stop lying when someone forces them to. You're not just fighting for the land, Caleb said, slowly, understanding dawning. You're fighting him. Every corrupt man who ever got away with it. She didn't deny it. Is that a problem? No, ma'am. He shook his head, something warm and fierce rising in his chest that he hadn't expected, hadn't planned for, hadn't wanted if he was honest with himself 3 weeks ago. That's about the finest reason I ever heard for fighting. Something shifted between them. After that night, not dramatic, not sudden, but real. A quiet recalibration in how they stood near each other, how they spoke the careful distance that had defined their first days together. Closing by inches, neither of them acknowledged out loud. They worked the next morning in near silence, rebuilding the scorched corner of the barn, and Caleb found himself watching her more than he should have, the set of her jaw, when she worked, the sharp focus in her eyes, when she paused to think through a problem, the way she'd started, without seeming to notice humming faint fragments of some tune under her breath while she worked. You hum when you're thinking, he said. She startled slightly, like she hadn't realized she was doing it. I do not. You do, ma'am. Been doing it since sunup. Color rose faintly in her cheeks, the first time he'd seen her flustered by anything that wasn't a bank ledger. It's a habit. From childhood. I wasn't aware I still did it. I like it, he said, before he could think better of it, and then felt his own face heat at how plainly the words had come out. She looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her eyes, and for once she didn't have a sharp reply. Reddy didn't correct him or redirect the conversation toward numbers and deadlines. Thank you, she said instead quietly, and went back to hammering the fence board in her hands with renewed focus, though Caleb noticed the faint smile she was fighting to hide. The reprieve didn't last. 2 days later, Tobias came riding up the road again, and this time his face carried news even worse than before. Mr. Mason, he said, breathless, Grover's filed criminal charges against you. Caleb felt the ground drop away beneath him for what felt like the 100th time that month. Charges for what? Theft. Says you took cattle off bank-secured collateral without authorization back when they seized your herd last spring. Says you hid 11 head instead of surrendering them proper. That's a lie. Every head I've got left I've got because the bank never came to collect them. There was no hiding involved. I know that, Mr. Mason. But Grover's filed it with the county sheriff, and he's saying if you don't settle the full debt by the deadline, he'll press the charges and see you arrested. Evelyn had gone very still, her mind clearly working through the implications faster than either man could follow. This is desperation, she said finally. He's not filing charges because he believes them. He's filing them because we found the Pratt lie, and he needs another weapon before we can prove it. Desperation or not, ma'am, it still gets Caleb thrown in a cell if he can't answer it. Then we don't give him the chance to throw anyone anywhere. Evelyn turned to Caleb, her eyes hard with a fury that had nothing soft left in it. We go to the territorial marshal. Today. Before Grover can use this charge to force your hand before the hearing. Ma'am, the nearest marshal's 2 days' ride. Then we ride 2 days, she said. Because I did not spend the last 2 weeks rebuilding this man's finances and proving his fraud only to watch him put my husband in a jail cell on a lie he invented out of panic. The word husband hung in the air between them for a moment, the first time she'd used it without qualification, without the careful distance she'd maintained since the stagecoach, and Caleb felt something tighten in his chest at the sound of it, something that had nothing to do with fear of the charges Grover had filed. All right, he said. We ride. They left within the hour, taking what little cash remained, riding hard toward the territorial seat, with the weight of everything they'd uncovered pressing down on both of them. The land behind them, the flock. The barn still smelling faintly of smoke, all of it left in the hands of a hastily hired neighbor boy, while they chased down the only authority that might stand between Caleb and a cell built on lies. They rode through the first night with barely a rest, Evelyn's endurance surprising him at every turn, her jaw set with the same relentless determination she brought to every ledger, every confrontation, every fight she'd taken on since stepping off that stagecoach. "You don't have to keep this pace," he said when they finally stopped to rest the horses near midnight. "Neither do you, and yet here we both are." She sat on a fallen log, rubbing feeling back into hands, raw from the rains, and looked at him with an exhaustion that went beyond the physical. "Caleb, if this doesn't work, if the marshal won't act in time, if Grover's charges stick even for a few days, don't. I need to say it. If they arrest you, I need to know what to do. Who to speak with. How to keep fighting the land claim without you there to... Evelyn." He said her name plain without title for the first time since she'd arrived, and something in the sound of it seemed to still her mid-sentence. "You'll keep fighting regardless of what happens to me. I know that much about you already, but it ain't going to come to that." "You can't know that." "No," he admitted. "But I know you. 3 weeks ago, I didn't believe there was a person alive who could out-argue Elias Grover in his own bank. Now I've watched you do it twice. I reckon you'll find a way to keep a rigged charge from sticking too if it comes to that." Something in her face softened the exhaustion and fear, giving way just for a moment to something gentler. "You trust me," she said, like the realization surprised her. "More than I've trusted anybody in a long while, ma'am." The silence between them shifted, then charged with something neither of them had let surface before. Not in the daylight, not with work to distract them, not with Grover's threats hanging over every waking hour. Caleb found himself closer to her than he'd meant to be close enough to see the exhaustion and fear and stubborn resolve all warring in her eyes at once. "Caleb," she started, and he didn't know if she meant to finish that sentence with a warning or something else entirely, because the sound of hoofbeats on the road behind them cut through the moment like a blade. They both went still, Caleb's hand dropping instinctively to the rifle across his saddle. "Riders," he said quietly. "Coming fast. Grover's men. Only one way to find out." He pulled Evelyn back into the shadow of the trees, rifle raised, heart hammering against his ribs, as the hoofbeats grew louder, closer, until 3 riders came into view on the moonlit road, and Caleb felt something cold settle in his gut as he recognized the man leading them. Not Grover. Worse. Silas Pratt's supposed lawyer, the one who'd filed the fraudulent lien riding hard toward the territorial seat, with the same urgency Caleb and Evelyn had been riding all night. "They're going to the marshal too," Evelyn whispered. "They must know we're headed there. They're trying to get there first, to plant their version of events before we can tell ours. Then we don't let them." Caleb swung back up into his saddle, every muscle in his body screaming with exhaustion, and looked over at Evelyn with a grim determination that matched her own. "Ma'am," he said, "I believe we've got a race on our hands." They didn't stay hidden long. Caleb watched the 3 riders disappear around the bend toward the territorial seat, and something in his chest told him waiting would cost them more than it saved. "We can't beat them there," he said. "Not on tired horses. We don't need to beat them. We need to reach the marshal before he's made up his mind about anything." Evelyn was already swinging back into her saddle, her exhaustion swallowed whole by something harder, more determined. A marshal who's heard one side of a story is still a marshal who can hear the other. "We're not racing them, Caleb. We're racing the moment his opinion sets like plaster." They pushed the horses through what remained of the night, and by the time the territorial seat came into view, more buildings than Cutter's Notch, a proper jail with iron bars, a marshal's office, with a lantern still burning. Despite the hour, Caleb's whole body ached with a fatigue that went bone deep. The 3 riders' horses stood hitched outside the marshal's office, lathered and blowing hard. "They beat us," Caleb said. "They got here first. That's not the same thing." Evelyn was already dismounting, straightening her coat with hands that trembled slightly from exhaustion, but didn't slow. "Let me do the talking." "Ma'am, you always say that. And it always works. Come on." Inside the marshal, a broad, gray-bearded man named Wyatt Pierce, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else at this hour, sat behind his desk, while Pratt's lawyer, a thin, oily man named Ezra Colt, stood across from him mid-sentence. And given the severity of the theft allegation, Marshal, I believe an immediate warrant is entirely justified. Marshal Pierce, Evelyn said, cutting through the room before Caleb could even take his hat off. My name is Evelyn Mason. I believe you're being asked to issue a warrant against my husband based on a fabricated debt and a false claim of cattle theft. Colt turned his thin face twisting with irritation. Marshal, this is exactly the kind of interference I warned you. You warned him about interference, Mr. Colt, or did you warn him about scrutiny? There's a difference, and I suspect you know it well. Evelyn stepped forward, setting a folder on the marshal's desk with a decisive thud. This document is a certified copy of a lien filed against my husband's property, claiming a debt owed to a man named Silas Pratt. I'd like you to know, Marshal, that Silas Pratt has been dead for 4 years. The room went silent. Marshal Pierce looked up slowly, his tired eyes sharpening. Dead, he repeated. 4 years of a fever in the high camps. I have a sworn witness in Cutter's Notch, a woman named Ruth Calloway who buried him herself, and who will testify that Silas Pratt never had 2 coins to lend anyone in his life, let alone $200 11 years past. Evelyn's voice didn't waver. The ink on this document is fresh, Marshal, newer than the date claims. I believe this lien was fabricated recently to justify an early foreclosure on my husband's land, and I believe the cattle theft charge Mr. Colt is here to file tonight is simply the next weapon in the same scheme timed precisely to have my husband arrested before he can dispute either claim. Colt's face had gone pale, then red. This is outrageous. Marshal, I demand. You demand. Marshal Pierce's voice was quiet, but it cut through Colt's protest like a blade. Mr. Colt, you rode 2 days to file a theft charge at midnight, the same week a foreclosure deadline's been moved up twice. That tells me somebody's in an awful hurry. He turned to Evelyn, studying her with new interest. You got that witness statement in writing, ma'am. I have Mrs. Calloway's word that she'll provide one formally under oath whenever this court requires it. That'll do for tonight. Pierce stood, and something in his bearing told Caleb the man had seen enough corrupt land grabs in his years, wearing that badge, to recognize the shape of one when it walked through his door. Mr. Colt, I'm not issuing any warrant tonight. Not on a theft charge tied to cattle nobody's reported stolen until a foreclosure got moved up. You want to file charges, you file them proper with evidence that holds up, and you do it in daylight, not by riding into my office past midnight, hoping I'm too tired to ask questions. Marshal, my client. Your client's dead, Mr. Colt, has been for 4 years if this lady's telling the truth, and I intend to find out for certain before anybody in this territory loses land over his name. Pierce's eyes swept to Caleb, taking his measure for the first time. Mason, you got 8 days left on that deadline. 6 now, Marshal, counting the ride here. Then you go home, and you keep fighting this the way you've been fighting it. I'll send a rider to Cutter's Notch within the week to look at that filing myself. In the meantime, his gaze shifted back to Colt, hard and unyielding. Nobody's getting arrested on a charge built out of a dead man's name. Colt gathered his papers with shaking hands and left without another word, and Caleb watched him go, feeling something loosen in his chest for the first time in what felt like days. That's one fight won. Evelyn said quietly, once the door had shut behind the lawyer. Feels like more than one, ma'am. She looked at him, exhaustion finally catching up to her all at once, and for a moment, something vulnerable slipped through the composed mask she wore so well. We should rest, she said. Even a few hours. We've got a hard ride back, and Grover's not finished. Men like him never are. They found a room at the small inn near the marshal's office, and for the first time since the stagecoach had rolled into Cutter's Notch, they didn't have the luxury of separate quarters. Only one room left, one bed, and a night too short and too exhausted for either of them to argue about propriety. Caleb took the floor without being asked, laying his coat down as a makeshift bedroll, and Evelyn didn't object, though she watched him for a long moment before finally speaking. "You don't have to do that." "Ma'am, I ain't in the habit of taking a bed while a lady sleeps on the ground. I meant—" She hesitated, something uncertain in her voice that he hadn't heard from her before. "You've done that for me. Since the trunk at the stagecoach. Small things. Things nobody's done for me in a long time." Caleb sat down on the floor, pulling his boots off with tired, deliberate movements, giving himself a moment before he answered. "My mother used to say a man's measured by what he does when nobody's grading him for it," he said finally. "I ain't doing it to be graded, Evelyn. I'm doing it because it's right." She was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had gone soft in a way he hadn't heard before, stripped of its usual sharp precision. "In Boston," she said, "nobody ever did anything without expecting something back. Even kindness had a price if you looked close enough." She paused. "I didn't expect to find something different out here. I didn't expect to find you." Caleb looked up at her in the dim light, something in his chest tightening at the rawness in her voice, the admission that seemed to cost her more than any ledger she'd ever balanced. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I didn't expect to find you either. Reckon we're both a little surprised by how this turned out." Neither of them said anything else that night, but the silence between them had changed, warmer, closer, charged with something neither of them was ready yet to name out loud. They rode back to Mason Ridge the next morning, and the closer they got, the more Caleb felt his gut tighten with dread. Some instinct warning him that 6 days remaining meant Grover would grow more desperate, not less. He was right. They crested the last hill to find Tobias waiting for them at the gate, his young face grim. "Mr. Mason," he said, "there's trouble, bad trouble." "What now?" "Grover's been talking to the freight company, the one that hauls goods out of Cutter's Notch to the mining camps up in the hills." Tobias's voice was tight with worry. "Word is, he's offered them a better rate to stop carrying any goods from Mason Ridge. Says if you try to sell eggs or produce to the camps, they won't haul it." Caleb felt something cold settle in his stomach. He's trying to cut off any income before the deadline hits. That's exactly what he's trying to do. Evelyn said, her jaw tight. "If we can't sell anything, we can't raise the difference between what we owe and what we've managed to save. He's boxing us in from every side." "Can he do that legally?" "Freight companies can choose who they haul for. There's nothing illegal about a business decision, even a spiteful one." Evelyn's eyes had gone hard calculating. "But it's not the only route to the camps. It's just the easiest one." "Ma'am, the other route goes through the pass. That's a full day's ride, rough terrain, and this time of year—" Caleb stopped himself, not wanting to say the rest out loud, though everyone standing there understood the risk. Summer storms in the high pass came sudden and violent, and more than one wagon had been lost to flash floods or rock slides trying to make that crossing. "Then we take the risk," Evelyn said, "because the alternative is losing everything to a man who thinks he's already won." The plan came together over the following 2 days, with a speed that left Caleb's head spinning. Evelyn calculating routes, loads, timing, negotiating directly with the mining camp foreman through letters carried by Tobias, building something out of desperation that started to look, despite everything, like an actual strategy. "If we can get even half our remaining stock to the Comstock camp before the deadline," she explained, spreading a rough map across the kitchen table. "The foreman there has agreed to pay up front in cash for eggs and produce. That solves the immediate debt. It doesn't solve everything, but it buys us room to breathe. And if the pass gives us trouble, then we've lost some eggs and a wagon, which is a smaller loss than losing everything to Grover's deadline." Caleb studied the map, tracing the route with his finger, feeling the weight of the decision settle heavy in his chest. "I'll drive the wagon myself." "We'll drive it together." "Evelyn, that pass ain't safe for a woman." Her eyebrow arched, the old sharpness returning to her voice. "Mr. Mason, I've spent the last 3 weeks discovering there is very little on this homestead I can't manage as well as you, and considerably better in matters of numbers. I intend to see this plan through myself, not send you into danger while I wait safely at home, wondering if you've survived it." He wanted to argue. Some old, stubborn instinct told him a man protected his wife from danger, kept her safe behind walls while he faced the mountain alone. But 3 weeks of watching her prove herself in the bank, in the recorder's office, in the marshal's midnight meeting, had taught him something he hadn't expected to learn. "All right," he said. "Together then." They loaded the wagon before dawn, every crate of eggs, every basket of produce salvaged from the half-neglected garden packed with careful precision under Evelyn's direction. The morning air held a chill that Caleb didn't like, a heaviness in the clouds gathering over the peaks that made his stomach tighten with old hard-earned instinct. "Storm's coming," he said. "Might be tonight, might be tomorrow. Hard to say for certain. Then we move faster." Evelyn climbed up onto the wagon seat beside him, wrapped tight in a coat too thin for the mountain air, her jaw set with determination. "How long to the pass?" 6 hours if the road holds, longer if it don't." They set off as the sun cleared the ridge, and for the first few hours the journey felt almost peaceful, the rhythm of the wagon wheels, the quiet between them settling into something companionable rather than tense. "You ever think about what happens after?" Evelyn asked, breaking the silence somewhere around mid-morning. "After the deadline, after all of it. If we win, if Grover stopped the land, secured the debt, settled fair." She was looking straight ahead at the road, but Caleb could hear something careful in her voice, like she was testing ground she wasn't sure would hold. "What does this homestead become once it's not just about survival anymore?" Caleb considered the question longer than he meant to, watching the road climb toward the pass ahead. "Never let myself think that far," he admitted. "Been so busy just trying to keep from losing everything, I never thought much on what keeping it might look like." "I have," she said quietly. "Thought about it more than I probably should, given we've been married 3 weeks and most of that time's been spent fighting a corrupt banker." "What do you see when you think on it?" She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice had gone softer than he'd ever heard it. "I see a flock that isn't dying. I see ledgers that balance because the business is honest and sound, not because I'm scrambling every night to find where the fraud's hiding. I see—" She stopped herself, color rising in her cheeks. "You see what, Evelyn? I see more than survival," she said finally, meeting his eyes for just a moment before looking back to the road. "I didn't expect to. 3 weeks ago I told myself I was marrying a stranger for practical reasons, nothing more. I didn't expect to start hoping for something bigger than that." Caleb felt something in his chest swell, warm and fierce, and he was about to answer when the first crack of thunder rolled down from the peaks ahead, loud enough to make the horses startle. "Storm's here," he said, and any answer he might have given her disappeared beneath the sudden urgent need to survive what was coming. The rain hit within the hour, and by the time they reached the mouth of the pass, it had turned from a steady fall into a driving, punishing torrent that turned the narrow trail into a river of mud. "We should turn back," Evelyn shouted over the wind. "Can't trail behind us is already washing out. Only way forward is through." The wagon lurched hard over a rut hidden beneath the churning mud, and Caleb fought the reins with white-knuckled hands, feeling the wheels slip and catch, every foot forward a battle against the mountain itself. "Rocks!" Evelyn screamed, pointing ahead, and Caleb saw it too late. A slide of loose stone tumbling down the slope above them, dislodged by the rain, crashing down toward the narrow trail just ahead of the horses. He hauled the reins hard, pulling the team to a screeching stop just as the rock slide crashed across the path a dozen feet ahead, close enough that Caleb felt the spray of mud and stone against his face. For a long, terrible moment, neither of them moved, hearts hammering, the horses screaming and rearing against their harnesses. "Everyone all right?" Caleb called, breathless. Yes, I'm all right." Evelyn's voice shook, but her hands were already steadying the reins beside his, helping calm the terrified horses. "The path, can we get past it?" Caleb looked at the rubble blocking the trail, jagged and half again, as tall as the wagon, and felt his stomach sink. "Not with the wagon. Not without clearing it first." "Then we clear it." They worked in the pounding rain, hauling stone by stone, hands raw and bleeding, every muscle screaming in protest. And Caleb found himself in awe again, Not for the first time of the woman beside him, who didn't complain, didn't slow, didn't once suggest turning back, despite the very real possibility that the mountain might kill them both before Grover's deadline ever got the chance. It took nearly 2 hours to clear enough of the slide to pass, and by the time they finally broke through, both of them were soaked to the bone, shaking with cold and exhaustion, the light already starting to fail around them. "We're losing daylight," Caleb said grimly. "Then we keep moving. We're closer to the camp than we are to home." They pressed on through the fading light, the rain finally beginning to ease, and Caleb felt something like hope flicker in his chest when the first distant lights of the Comstock mining camp came into view against the darkening mountainside. "We made it," he breathed. "We're not finished yet," Evelyn said, though even her voice carried a note of relief. "We still need the foreman to honor his word." The foreman, a broad-shouldered man named Otis Reyes, met them at the edge of camp with a lantern held high, squinting against the rain that had settled into a light drizzle. "You actually came through the pass," he said, disbelief plain in his voice. "In this weather, most men wouldn't have risked it. Most men aren't facing a foreclosure in 5 days," Caleb said, climbing down stiff and exhausted from the wagon seat. "We had the eggs. We had the produce. We had your word you'd pay up front." Reyes studied them both for a long moment, taking in the mud, the exhaustion, the raw and bleeding hands from clearing the rock slide, and something in his expression shifted respect maybe, or something close to it. "Grover came through here 2 days back," he said slowly. "Offered me a better rate if I refused to deal with you at all. Told me you were finished, that dealing with a dying homestead was bad business." Caleb felt his stomach drop. And I told him my men need eggs and fresh produce more than they need a banker's favor, and that a man who rides through a mountain pass in a storm to keep his word is exactly the kind of supplier I want dealing with my camp. Reyes extended a broad, calloused hand. "Cash on delivery, same as I promised your wife in her letters. And Mrs. Mason." He turned to Evelyn, tipping his hat with genuine respect. "I don't believe I've ever seen a woman haul rock out of a landslide before. My men could use someone with that kind of grit." Evelyn managed a tired, relieved laugh. "I'll take that as a compliment, Mr. Reyes." "Meant as one, ma'am." They unloaded the wagon under lantern light, and when Reyes counted out the payment into Caleb's shaking hands, more money than they'd seen in one place, in longer than he could remember, Caleb felt something break loose in his chest, something that had been coiled tight with fear since the day the foreclosure notice first arrived. "This is enough," he said, his voice rough. "With what we've already saved, this is enough to cover the actual debt. The real one, not Grover's inflated figure." "Then we've done it," Evelyn said, and for the first time since she'd stepped off that stagecoach, Caleb saw something unguarded and joyful break across her face. Exhaustion and relief tangled together into something that looked for just a moment like pure happiness. They didn't make it home that night, too exhausted, the horses too spent to risk the pass again in darkness, and Reyes offered them shelter in a spare cabin at the edge of camp, dry and warm against the last of the storm's fury. Caleb built a small fire while Evelyn peeled off her soaked coat, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, simply breathing in the relief of having survived a day that had tried more than once to kill them both. "We did it," she said again, quieter this time, like she still couldn't quite believe it. "You did it," Caleb said. "The pass, the foreman, the payment, all of it was your plan, Evelyn. I just drove the wagon." "You drove the wagon through a rock slide and a mountain storm without once suggesting we turn back. That's not nothing, Caleb." He looked at her across the small fire, mud-streaked and exhausted, and more beautiful to him in that moment than any woman he'd ever known, and felt something in his chest finally give way to what he'd been fighting since that first morning at the stagecoach stop. "Evelyn," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me say it plain, without correcting my arithmetic partway through." A small surprised laugh escaped her. "All right. I sent for a wife to tend chickens. I told myself that's all I wanted, all I needed, hands to help save the land, nothing more. I was lying to myself before I even knew I was doing it." He held her gaze steady, despite the nervous hammering of his heart. "I don't want just a partner in this anymore, Evelyn. I want you. Not because of the ledgers, not because of the bank, not because you saved my land 3 times over in 3 weeks. Because somewhere in the middle of all this fighting, I fell in love with the way you refuse to lose." The fire crackled between them, and for a long moment, Evelyn said nothing, her eyes bright with something that looked dangerously close to tears. "I told myself the same lie," she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "That I came out here for practical reasons. That I'd learned my lesson about trusting anyone with my heart after Boston." She reached across the small space between them, her fingers finding his mud-streaked and raw from the day's labor. "I was wrong too, Caleb. I fell in love with a man who insisted on carrying my trunk when I told him I didn't need the help." He closed the distance between them slowly, giving her every chance to pull away if she wanted to, and when she didn't, when she leaned into him instead, her exhausted, relieved laugh turning soft against his mouth. Caleb felt something settle in his chest that no ledger, no deadline, no corrupt banker could ever take from him again. They rode back to Mason Ridge the next morning with cash enough to save the Landharts fuller than either had expected and hope blooming, despite everything they'd survived to reach this moment. But hope, Caleb had learned by now, never lasted long on this mountain without something rising to test it. They crested the final hill toward home, to find 3 unfamiliar horses tied outside the house, and Grover himself standing on the porch, flanked by 2 men Caleb had never seen before. His thin smile stretched wide with something that looked disturbingly like triumph. "Mr. Mason," Grover called out as they approached, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "I'm afraid you're a bit late, and I'm afraid the news I have for you won't wait until you've climbed down from that wagon." Evelyn's hand found Caleb's gripping tight, and he felt the same cold dread settle over him that he'd felt reading that first foreclosure notice weeks ago. "What have you done, Grover?" he called back, his voice hard. Grover's smile widened. "I've simply been doing my job, Mr. Mason, protecting the bank's interests." He gestured to the 2 men beside him, both wearing the unmistakable look of hired muscle rather than legitimate business associates. "And making certain that whatever cash you manage to scrape together on your little trip won't be enough to save you. Not anymore." "Not enough!" Evelyn's voice cut across the yard before Caleb could even climb down from the wagon, sharp and unshaken, despite the dread coiling in her stomach. "What exactly have you done, Mr. Grover?" Grover descended the porch steps slowly, savoring the moment, the way a man savors a meal he's waited too long to eat. "I've filed an emergency injunction with the county court, effective this morning. It freezes all assets and payments related to the Mason property pending resolution of the outstanding lien claim and the theft investigation." His smile sharpened. "Which means, Mrs. Mason, that whatever money you've brought home today cannot legally be applied to the debt. Not until the injunction is lifted. And injunctions, as you likely know from your banking days, can take months to resolve." Caleb felt the cash in his coat pocket suddenly weigh 1,000 pounds useless paper against a legal maneuver he didn't fully understand, but understood well enough to fear. "That's not possible," Evelyn said, though something in her voice had gone tight, calculating. "The Pratt lien is fraudulent. I have a witness. The marshal himself said he'd investigate." "The marshal's investigation hasn't concluded, Mrs. Carter." Grover's use of her maiden name was deliberate, a small cruelty meant to remind her she had no standing here that he couldn't strip away with the stroke of a pen. "Until it does, the lien stands as filed, and my injunction stands with it. You can pay every dollar you scrape together riding through that storm, and it won't matter one bit, because the court won't let the payment be applied." Caleb stepped down from the wagon, his boots hitting the dirt, hard, every muscle in his body coiled tight with a fury he hadn't felt since the day he'd fed that first foreclosure notice to the stove. "You're stalling," he said. "You know the lien's fake. You know Pratt's been dead 4 years. You're just buying time to bury us in paperwork until we run out of days. I'm protecting the bank's interests, Mr. Mason. That's all this has ever been." Grover's eyes flicked toward the 2 men flanking him, both silent, both watching Caleb with the flat, assessing look of men paid to intimidate rather than reason. "Now I'd recommend you and your wife gather whatever you intend to take with you. The injunction also grants the bank authority to begin inventory of the property effective immediately, in anticipation of the foreclosure proceeding once the theft charge is properly filed." "You said the marshal refused the warrant," Caleb said. "The marshal refused a warrant issued at midnight on incomplete evidence. I have considerably more evidence now." Grover reached into his coat and produced a folded paper, holding it just out of reach, taunting. "A sworn statement from a ranch hand who says he witnessed you moving cattle off bank-secured collateral last spring. Signed, notarized, entirely legitimate." "That's a lie. I don't even know who that could be." "His name is Wendell Cross. I believe you know him." Caleb's stomach dropped. Wendell Cross had worked for him 2 summers back, before he'd been let go for drinking through his wages and showing up late more mornings than not. A man with every reason to hold a grudge, and precisely the kind of desperate soul Grover would know how to buy. "He's lying," Caleb said, but even to his own ears the protest sounded thin against the weight of a notarized statement. Perhaps. Courts tend to prefer sworn testimony over protestation. "Mr. Mason." Grover tucked the paper back into his coat, satisfaction radiating off him like heat off summer pavement. "You have until sundown to vacate the main house. My men will begin the inventory at first light tomorrow." He turned to walk back toward his horse, and Caleb felt something in his chest crack wide open. Not fear anymore, but a fury so complete it left no room for anything else. "Grover." The banker paused, glancing back. "You buried an innocent man's name under a lie to steal his son's land." Caleb said, his voice low and dangerous in a way Evelyn had never heard from him before. "You hired a drunk to swear false testimony. You tried to have me arrested on a midnight warrant so I couldn't fight back. And you think a piece of paper is going to be the thing that finally beats us." Something flickered across Grover's face, not quite fear, but close enough to it that Caleb saw it and held on to it. "The law is the law, Mr. Mason," Grover said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "I'd advise you to accept that before it costs you more than the land." He mounted his horse and rode off with his 2 hired men trailing behind him, leaving Caleb and Evelyn standing in the yard, amid the wreckage of everything they'd fought so hard over so many days to save. Evelyn didn't move for a long moment after the riders disappeared down the road, her jaw tight, her mind visibly working through the wreckage of what they'd just been told. "An injunction," she said finally, mostly to herself. "He's smarter than I gave him credit for. Not smart enough to invent a real debt, but smart enough to bury us in procedure while the real fight gets decided. Can you beat it? I don't know yet." She turned to him, and for the first time since the stagecoach, Caleb saw genuine uncertainty in her eyes. Not panic, not despair, but the honest acknowledgement of a problem she hadn't fully solved. Injunctions typically require a judge's signature, not just a filing. If Grover secured this one from a friendly judge without proper cause, that's a different kind of fraud than the lien, a more serious one. Meaning what? Meaning if I can prove the injunction itself was improperly granted, it collapses the same way the lien will once the marshal's investigation concludes. But I need to see the actual court order, not just Grover's word that it exists. "You think he's lying about the injunction too?" "I think Elias Grover has lied to us at every single turn since the day you walked into his bank, Caleb. I'm not inclined to take his word for anything without seeing it in writing signed by an actual judge." She was already moving toward the house, her exhaustion from the pass and the storm and the ride home seemingly forgotten, replaced by the same relentless focus that had carried her through every fight so far. "We ride to the county seat. Today. If that injunction exists, I want to see it with my own eyes. Evelyn, we've been riding for 2 days straight. The horses can rest for 2 hours while we eat something and gather what evidence we have. Then we ride." She stopped at the porch steps, turning back to look at him, something fierce and unbroken in her expression, despite everything Grover had just thrown at them. "He wants us exhausted and desperate, Caleb. Reacting instead of thinking. I refuse to give him that." They rode into the county seat that afternoon, and this time, Caleb noticed something had shifted in how Evelyn carried herself, not the careful, controlled composure of a woman still finding her footing in unfamiliar territory, but something harder, more certain, forged by 3 weeks of fighting men who'd underestimated her at every turn. The courthouse clerk, a nervous young man who clearly recognized trouble walking through his door, confirmed what Evelyn had suspected the moment they asked. "There's no injunction on file," he said, flipping anxiously through his ledger. "Nothing filed against a Mason property. Not this week, not this month." Evelyn went very still. "You're certain?" "Yes, ma'am. I'd have processed it myself if it came through this office." "Is there another office that could have issued it? A different judge, perhaps?" The clerk hesitated. "Judge Whitmore handles emergency filings out of his home most weeks when the courthouse is closed. But I'd have record of it here regardless, even a same-day filing. There's nothing." Caleb felt something hot and vindicating rise in his chest. He lied. The whole injunction, he made it up. "It would seem so," Evelyn said, though her voice carried a controlled fury, now sharper than anything Caleb had heard from her yet. "Which means everything he told us this morning. The frozen assets, the inventory, the deadline to vacate all of it, was fabricated to frighten us into giving up before we could apply our payment to the actual debt." Why would he risk that lying outright with no paper to back it? Because he's desperate, Caleb. A man who invents a debt against a dead prospector, hires a drunk to falsely accuse you of theft, and now fabricates an injunction out of thin air isn't a careful patient predator anymore. He's a man who knows he's losing and is grasping at anything he can find to stop it. Something almost fierce crossed her face. "Which means we're closer to beating him than we realized. We just need to move faster than his lies can." They rode straight from the courthouse to the marshal's office, only to find Marshal Pierce already saddling his horse, a grim, determined look on his weathered face. "Mason, Mrs. Mason." He nodded to them both. "Good timing. I was fixing to ride out to Cutter's Notch myself. Got some findings I believe you'll want to hear." "About the Pratt lien?" Evelyn asked. "About considerably more than that." Pierce's jaw tightened. "I sent a deputy to speak with the notary who supposedly witnessed that lien filing. Man folded inside of 10 minutes, once he understood perjury charges were on the table. Says Grover paid him $50 to notarize a document he never actually witnessed being signed." Caleb felt the ground shift beneath him, this time in his favor. He confessed, "In writing signed, witnessed by my deputy." Pierce's eyes were hard. "And there's more. Your cattle hand, Wendell Cross, the one who swore you stole cattle off bank collateral. He's currently drinking away a $50 advance in a Cutter's Notch saloon, telling anyone who'll listen that Grover paid him to sign a statement he didn't fully understand." "He's talking about it in public?" Evelyn asked, something almost disbelieving in her voice. "Drunk men talk, Mrs. Mason. That's usually how these things unravel." Pierce swung up into his saddle. "I've got enough now to bring formal charges against Elias Grover. Fraud, subornation of perjury, fabrication of legal documents. I'm riding to Cutter's Notch this afternoon to make the arrest myself." Something in Caleb's chest, coiled tight for weeks, finally began to loosen. "There's one more thing," Evelyn said quickly. "He told us this morning he'd filed an emergency injunction freezing our assets and payments. We just confirmed at the courthouse that no such injunction exists." Pierce's expression darkened further. "Impersonating a court order, threatening a citizen with fabricated legal authority, that's a serious charge on top of everything else." He looked between them, something almost respectful in his gaze. "You two have done more investigating in 3 weeks than most territorial officials manage in a year. I'll see this handled properly, I promise you that." "Marshal," Caleb said, "we've got 6 days left on that deadline. If Grover's arrested, who confirms the actual debt? Who do we pay? I'll see to it. The bank's board is notified today that the true balance is confirmed by an independent auditor rather than anything Grover's touched. Given what we are uncovering, I doubt any of them will want their names attached to this mess a moment longer than necessary." Pierce tipped his hat. "Go home. Rest. I'll send word the moment this is resolved." Chetritai. They rode back to Mason Ridge as the sun began its slow descent behind the peaks, and for the first time in what felt like weeks, Caleb let himself breathe without the tight, constant press of dread in his chest. "We're going to win this," he said, mostly to convince himself it was true. "We already have," Evelyn said quietly. "Grover just doesn't know it yet." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the tension of the day slowly draining out of both of them, replaced by something like exhausted relief. "Evelyn," Caleb said eventually, "what you said last night, in the cabin, about falling in love with a fool who insisted on carrying your trunk." A small smile tugged at her mouth. "I remember." "Did you mean it? Or was that just exhaustion talking after everything with the pass and the storm?" She reined her horse closer to his, close enough that their knees nearly touched, and looked at him with an openness he hadn't seen from her since Boston's ghosts had first cracked through her careful composure. "I meant every word," she said. "I've spent my whole life being told competence and softness can't exist in the same person. That a woman who's good with numbers has to be cold, has to be alone, has to choose between being respected and being loved." Her voice caught slightly. "You never once asked me to choose Caleb. You just let me be exactly what I am, and somehow that made me want to be more than I ever thought I could." Caleb reached over, taking her hand in his, despite the awkward reach between two moving horses, and held it there the rest of the way home, saying nothing more, because nothing more needed saying. They arrived back at Mason Ridge to find the house untouched, no inventory. Crew, no hired muscle waiting on the porch. Just the quiet, ordinary sight of their own land in the fading light, chickens settling for the night. The barn's scorched corner, a reminder of everything they'd survived rather than a fresh wound. But the peace didn't last through the night. Caleb woke near midnight to the sound of Evelyn's sharp intake of breath beside him, and he was up and reaching for his rifle before he'd even fully registered what had startled her. "Someone's outside," she whispered. "I heard the coop latch." They moved together toward the window, and in the pale moonlight, Caleb saw a figure crouched near the coop. Not the careful, deliberate movements of Grover's hired men, but something more frantic, more desperate. "Stay here," Caleb said. "Absolutely not." He didn't have time to argue. He was already moving toward the door, rifle in hand. Evelyn closed behind him despite his instruction, and when he stepped out into the yard, the figure by the coop startled upright, revealing a face Caleb recognized instantly. Wendell Cross. Cross. Caleb's voice was hard, rifle raised, but not aimed. "What in God's name are you doing on my land at midnight?" Wendell's hands went up immediately, shaking his face, pale and sweating despite the cool night air. "Mr. Mason, please, I ain't here to cause trouble, I swear it." "You signed a false statement saying I stole cattle. Give me one reason not to march you straight to the marshal myself. That's why I'm here." Wendell's voice cracked desperation, bleeding through every word. "I heard tell today that Grover's fixing to get arrested. Heard the marshal's got proof I lied. I got scared, Mr. Mason. I didn't know what I was signing. Not really Grover's man, just told me it was a formality. Said there wouldn't be no trouble from it, paid me $50 I ain't had in months." He was nearly crying now, the bravado of a man drinking away guilty money entirely gone. "I come here tonight because I wanted to tell you myself before the marshal comes for me. I'm sorry. God help me, I'm sorry. I never meant for it to go this far." "Unbeaten." Evelyn stepped forward, her voice steady despite the tension of the moment. "Mr. Cross, will you tell the marshal exactly what you just told us, in writing under oath?" "Yes, ma'am. I'll tell him everything. Every bit of it." Wendell wiped at his face with a trembling hand. "Grover come to me 2 weeks back, said he needed a favor, said it wouldn't hurt nobody none. I needed the money bad enough, I didn't ask too many questions. I should have asked." "That's not an excuse," Caleb said, though some of the hardness had gone out of his voice. "No, sir, it ain't. But it's the truth and I aim to make it right." Wendell straightened slightly, some fragment of dignity returning to his posture. "I'll ride to the marshal myself first thing. Tell him everything Grover paid me to say, and everything that was a lie." He left as quickly as he'd come, disappearing into the darkness on a horse that looked nearly as tired as its rider, and Caleb stood there in the yard, with Evelyn beside him, feeling the last fragile piece of Grover's scheme finally begin to crumble entirely. "That's it," Evelyn said quietly. "That's everything. The lien, the injunction, the theft charge, all of it falls apart now. You think he'll actually testify? Guilt does strange things to desperate men, Caleb. Sometimes it makes them lie harder. Sometimes it makes them finally tell the truth. She looked up at him, moonlight catching the exhausted but hopeful line of her face. I think Wendell Cross just decided which kind of man he wants to be. The days that followed moved with a speed that left Caleb's head spinning, each piece of Grover's fabricated scheme collapsing in rapid succession like a house built on sand, finally meeting the tide. Marshal Pierce arrested Elias Grover on the fourth day, walking him out of the bank in irons, while half the town watched from the boardwalk, the same crowd that had once whispered about Caleb's doomed land, now whispering about the banker they'd trusted without question for years. Wendell Cross gave his statement exactly as promised, and though he faced his own consequences for the false testimony, his willingness to come forward and correct it before real damage was done softened the punishment considerably. A fine, a formal apology, and the marshal's grudging acknowledgement that a man who corrected his own lie deserved some measure of mercy for it. The bank's board, faced with mounting evidence of Grover's fraud, moved quickly to distance themselves from him entirely. A new manager arrived from the territorial capital within the week, and one of his first acts was reviewing the Mason account, personally confirming Evelyn's calculations to the dollar. $210, the new manager said, sliding the revised paperwork across the desk to them both. That's the accurate balance accounting for the improperly compounded interest. I understand you have that amount in hand. We do, Evelyn said, and Caleb watched her hands remain perfectly steady as she counted out the payment money earned through a mountain storm, a rock slide, and a desperate ride to a mining camp that could have killed them both. Then this debt is settled, the manager said, stamping the paperwork with a finality that made something in Caleb's chest crack open with relief, so profound it nearly buckled his knees. The land is yours free and clear, Mr. Mason. My sincere apologies for what you both endured getting to this point. They walked out of that bank together into the bright afternoon sun of Cutter's Notch, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all, just stood there, breathing in the reality of a fight finally completely won. We did it, Caleb said finally, his voice rough with emotion he didn't try to hide. We did, Evelyn agreed. And when he pulled her into his arms right there on the boardwalk in front of God and half the town she didn't pull away, didn't worry about propriety or gossip or anything except the solid, real feeling of a fight they'd survived together. Petayero watched from the mercantile window, her mouth pressed into a thin line, and for once, she said nothing at all. The weeks that followed felt like a different life entirely. Not the desperate day-to-day survival of those first exhausting days, but something steadier, something built with intention instead of panic. Evelyn's plan for the flock worked exactly as she'd calculated. Clean feed, proper record keeping, careful attention to which hens were laying well and which needed culling. Within a month, the coop had transformed from a source of dread into a source of quiet pride. Healthy birds producing eggs. Enough not just for their own table, but for trade. We could sell the surplus, Evelyn said one evening, reviewing her latest ledger by lamplight, a habit that had become as much a part of their evenings as dinner itself. Not just to the Comstock camp. There's 3 other mining operations within a day's ride, all of them needing reliable food sources. You're thinking bigger than just surviving, Caleb said, watching her work with the same fascination he'd felt since that very first sleepless night. I'm thinking about what this land could become if we stop just trying to keep our heads above water and start building something real. She looked up at him, something bright and determined in her eyes. You have good grazing land, Caleb, solid water access. What if we didn't just raise a small flock to scrape by? What if we built something bigger? Supply contracts with every mining camp in the territory. A proper operation, instead of a homestead, barely holding on. That's a big undertaking for 2 people. Then we hire help, honest help paid fair wages, people who need work as much as this land needs hands. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and Caleb found himself leaning into the vision she was painting rather than pulling back from it. I've already calculated what it would take. The land can support it, Caleb. We just needed to stop fighting for survival long enough to see it. He looked at her, the woman who'd stepped off a stagecoach 3 months ago as a stranger, who'd rebuilt his finances in a single sleepless night, who'd hauled rock out of a landslide and stared down a corrupt banker without once backing away, and felt something settle deep in his chest, certain and unshakable. "Then let's build it," he said. "Together." They were married properly that autumn, not the practical business-like arrangement that had brought them together, but a real ceremony, small and simple, held right there on Mason Ridge, with Ruth Calloway and Marshall Pierce, and even Tobias Hale, standing witness among the handful of neighbors who'd come to see two people. The whole territory had watched fight for everything they had. Ruth cried through most of it, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, and muttering something about Caleb's father being proud wherever he was watching from. And Caleb found he couldn't disagree with her, though the thought brought its own quiet ache alongside the joy. "Your father would have liked her," Ruth said afterward, squeezing his hand with the same warmth she'd shown that day in her boarding house, delivering truths that had changed everything. "Man who paid his debts honest would have respected a woman who fights that hard for what's right." "I believe he would have too," Caleb said, and meant it. The following spring brought the first real test of everything they'd built. Not a crisis this time, but an opportunity, a chance to prove that what they'd fought so hard to save could actually flourish. The territorial fair in the county seat drew ranchers and farmers from across the region, and Evelyn had insisted against Caleb's initial doubts that they enter their flock's eggs and their expanding produce operation into the competition. "Nobody's going to take a chicken farm seriously against the big cattle operations," Caleb had argued. "Then we'll change what they take seriously." Evelyn had answered, already sketching out a presentation of their records, their growth, the careful system she'd built from nothing but a burned ledger and sheer determination. They won not the grand prize, but something Caleb found he valued more: recognition from the Territorial Agricultural Board for the most improved operation in the region, along with contracts from 2 new mining camps eager to secure reliable supply after word spread of the honest, well-run operation out at Mason Ridge. Standing in the fairground that evening, watching Evelyn accept congratulations from ranchers twice their operation size, Caleb felt something he hadn't expected to feel again after all those years of grief and struggle. Pride. Not just in the land, not just in what they'd built, but in the woman standing beside him, who'd refused at every single turn to let anyone convince her she couldn't do exactly what she'd set out to do. 2 years passed, and Mason Ridge became something neither of them could have imagined that first desperate morning when Caleb fed a foreclosure notice to the stove and told himself a man with 2 working hands wasn't beaten yet. The flock had grown into the largest poultry operation in the county, supplying eggs and dressed birds to 6 different mining camps and 2 growing towns besides Cutter's Notch. Evelyn had trained 3 local women in her bookkeeping methods, paying them fair wages to help manage the growing operation's finances. Women who'd once been dismissed the same way she'd been dismissed in Boston, now building careers nobody could take from them the way Harlan Voss had once taken hers. Caleb had expanded the barn twice, hired on 4 ranch hands to help manage the growing operation, and found somewhere in the process of building something real that the grief he'd carried since his father's death had transformed into something gentler, not forgotten, never forgotten, but no longer the crushing weight it had once been. They stood together on the porch one evening in early summer, watching the sun drop behind the ridge in streaks of gold and orange, the same porch where Grover had once stood delivering threats that had nearly broken everything they'd fought for. "You remember that first morning?" Caleb asked. "When you corrected my arithmetic in front of half the town, before you'd even said hello properly?" Evelyn laughed, the easy, warm sound that had become as familiar to him now as his own heartbeat. "I remember thinking you looked like a man who hadn't slept in a week and had no idea what he was walking into, marrying a stranger sight unseen." "I didn't. Not the first idea. Neither did I," she admitted, leaning into him as his arm settled around her shoulders. "I thought I was answering a wire for practical survival. I never imagined I'd find someone who'd let me be exactly who I am, who'd fight beside me instead of asking me to shrink myself smaller. I thought I was hiring a wife to tend chickens, Caleb said quietly, echoing the words that had started this whole impossible, beautiful journey. Turned out, I married the only person alive who could turn a dying homestead into something worth building a whole life around. She turned to look at him, the golden evening light catching in her eyes 3 years of fighting and building and loving, written plain across both their faces. "We didn't just save this land, Caleb," she said. "We built something Grover never understood, something men like him never will." He thought power came from lies, from control, from taking what other people built through fear. Her hand found his steady and certain, the way it had been steady through every storm they'd weathered together. But real power was never about taking. It was about two people who refused to lose, who chose each other and chose this land, and chose to build something honest out of everything that tried to break them. Caleb pulled her closer, watching the last light fade, gold and soft over the ridge that had once nearly cost him everything, and felt for the first time in longer than he could remember something that wasn't survival. It was home. It was hers. It was theirs. And nothing, not Grover, not the bank, not the mountain itself in its cruelest storms would ever take it from them again.